My name is Greg Hodge, and I'm the Interim Executive Director for the Executive Alliance of Boys and Men of Color. And I want to welcome you to this conversation, Confronting COVID and Justice System Transformation. I want to thank our staff and our consultants, Ariana Austin and Niaz Kazravi and Akin Abioye, who have been helping us set this up for a good conversation today. We know that we're living in a really interesting moment, and that those of us who pay attention to culture, whatever community we come from, we always want to acknowledge our ancestors and the Creator for giving us another day, another opportunity to do the work. This week in particular, in this last 10 days or so, even as we think about and we grieve and the righteous outrage around the killing of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and others, Eric Salgado here in California, we know that our ancestors left us a legacy of hope and faith and understanding of things that we could do things in our time. John Lewis, who made his transition at the age of 80 years old after living a very full life, wrote a wonderful last word op-ed piece that was published in the New York Times last week. And one of the things that Brother Lewis reminded us of is that each generation has an opportunity and a duty to take human life and social life forward. And so we're hoping that today's conversation will be helpful to those of you who are doing the work, either responding to the pandemic and the transformational work in law enforcement and our judicial system that we know is long overdue. We know that we are sort of facing sort of three related situations. One, a global pandemic that has hit the U.S. hard and communities of color in extraordinarily hard ways. Our Native American community, and we always want to acknowledge our Native American brothers and sisters wherever we are, that the African American and the Latinx communities have been hit very hard. People who are essential workers, folks who are incarcerated, folks who are in nursing homes have been hit the hardest even within those groups. We know the prisons and jails, like the county jail here in Alameda County at Santa Rita and San Quentin prison, one of the largest prisons in the state of California, have become epicenters for the spread of the coronavirus. With the U.S. having 2.3 million people incarcerated, that's a devastating development. And at the same time, the issues of police accountability, how our judicial system operates, and racial injustice are at the forefront of the protests and advocacy efforts after the killing of Mr. Floyd and Sister Taylor in Louisville. So today we've got several people who are going to help us have this conversation. We will have a question and answer period toward the end of this hour and a half. You can populate your questions in the question and answer box or in the chat room so that we can take those questions in turn. What I want to do now is introduce our first friend and our first thought partner, someone who has gained some national attention in a couple of different ways. Keith Ellison is currently serving as the Minnesota Attorney General. He served in the U.S. Congress from 2007 to 2019. He holds the distinction of being the first Muslim American to be elected to Congress and the first African American to be elected to Congress from Minnesota, and the first Muslim to hold statewide office in the United States as a Muslim. We are very glad that Brother Ellison has agreed to join us today to share some of his thoughts about where we are with these dual challenges of the pandemic and as we think about and work toward transformation of our criminal justice systems. And Brother Ellison, on a personal note, we're really glad that you're joining us. We know that you lost your mom to the COVID virus, and our condolences to your family, and we'll keep you in our prayers. So I'm going to welcome Brother Ellison to the conversation, and assalamu alaikum, brother. And we can see you.
Now you can hear me.
And now we can hear you. Yeah. How are you doing today?
Let me say wa alaikum salam, and let me say thank you for your beautiful and very kind introduction. And let me also add that you cannot be an African American Muslim and not thank so many people in the Christian community, like my mom, right? My mom told me, hey, look, son, whatever you want to do that fulfills your soul, you got to do that, And my mom was the result of 10 generations of Black Catholics from Louisiana. So, and she embraced my spiritual journey. So thank you for mentioning her, my hero. And I know I speak for many people, and today we're talking about boys and men of color. I know I'm speaking for many boys and men of color who will always remember mama, right?
That's right.
Yeah. So what is the difference between the moment we are in now and the moment we were in 1 year ago? The difference is that is the same difference between a room that is well lit up and a room that was kind of dimmer, right? Both rooms, you can see the bed, you can see the tables, you can see the chairs, but in the bright sunshine, the gleaming light of this moment, man, you can't miss a trick, man. It's all right there in front of you.
That's right.
Now, my role in the prosecution of the officers who are charged with killing George Floyd prevents me from talking specifically about that case. But what I can tell you is that there are things in life when you don't have to explain it, all you got to do is show it. See? I mean, why is it that now people like Mitt Romney and others are saying Black Lives Matter, whereas a few years ago they would never have said that?
That's right.
I don't believe it's only cynicism. I believe it's like, well, what we were trying to tell you is, within the context of this society, Black lives don't matter. So we must assert and declare Black lives do matter. It's not a negation of anybody else's life. It's an assertion of our own life. And before, people want to say, oh, well, all lives matter. So now, wait a minute. Wait a minute. We know that. We're talking about our lives right now.
That's right.
Because not everybody getting shot down by the police daily in their home, outside their home, all that. You know what I mean? But so now the whole rest of the country is recognizing what it should always have known is that Black life, which has done so much for this country, formed the bedrock of this nation's wealth, has always been cast aside and used in a transactional way. If we need you to make our farms run, that's one thing. If we don't, then once we move our factories overseas, we don't care if you are working or not. You were never here to participate in this society. But what we say is, just because that's your plan, that does not mean that's our plan. Our plan is we count, we matter, we're relevant, and we're going to make our mark on this society.
That's right.
So what I say is that, what does the pandemic tell us? The pandemic just tells us what we already knew. It tells us that large percentages of people of color are essential workers, therefore exposed to the virus more than anybody else. It tells that if you're essential, that if you are laid off because of unemployment, because of COVID, then you lose your health care insurance, right? It tells you that in the context of this criminal justice system, that, look, for 250 years approximately, Black people were chattel, sold like chickens, cows, and anything else. Whole generations of Black people were born, lived their whole lives, and died in a state of anti-freedom, unfreedom. If you ran away, you could be charged with theft. Theft of what? Yourself. Yourself. This is the reality. You stole yourself from me because I own you. And right. I can get the instrumentality of the federal government to go catch you if you are anywhere south of the Canadian border and drag you back to my plantation right down here in Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, blah, blah, blah.
Yep.
So this is the deal. So I just say, that what we see now is a system laid bare, undeniable to anybody with eyes. If you don't want to see what's in front of you now, let's just say you're anti-Black and you mean to hold us down, period. Let's just admit that so we don't have to go through any changes about that.
Right. No, that's right.
Let's also say this. Your anti-Blackness is actually tied up in your worldview, because these people who are so racist against us, they don't really love white people very much. Think about it. If you can pay me nothing, then you can pay him next to nothing.
Next to nothing. Right.
Right. I
That's
mean,
right.
I mean, look, look, it was Lyndon Johnson who said, if you can convince the worst white man that he's better than the best black man, then you can pick his pocket. I would argue to you that American racism is one of the leading tools to control the white working people. Because as long as they believe somebody's lower than them, they will put up with all kinds of crazy.
Yeah.
But today, things really, there is a reason to be hopeful. And you know what? I'm just going to confess right up front, I'm a hopeful person. I am an optimist. That's how I am. That's how I roll. Other people are like, well, everything sucks. Nothing's getting better. Everything's bad. Fine. You can look at the world that way. I don't look at the world that way. In fact, I am hopeful and optimistic when I look that Missouri just passed Medicaid expansion.
Yeah.
It's not what I want, which is universal single payer health care for everybody, but it's a step forward. 37 states now have it. It's saying that while the Republican conservative leadership would deny people health care, the electorate would expand it.
Let me ask you a question.
Yeah, go for it.
As you're talking about healthcare and health, can you talk a little bit about, and you talked about this sort of invisibility. We have a lot of people who are incarcerated who are getting sick. And unless you're working in this, you don't really know that. So I'm just curious from your perspective, like, how do you make sure that our folks who are incarcerated, who are at risk of COVID-19, how are they getting protected in the systems that you are seeing in your state and and as you move around the country and talking to people?
Well, what we have to do is demand anybody in authority to let people out of these incarceratorial systems where they cannot safely socially distance, right?
Right.
I'm gonna tell you this, and I'm not just talking, I'm walking my talk. We've already let people out of Minnesota correctional facilities even before the end of their sentence so that they could be protected, because going to jail because you stole something or did something doesn't mean a death sentence. We don't have a death penalty in Minnesota. So how could holding somebody in incarceration mean that we're gonna hold them in a situation where you could lose your life? So we have moved with the Department of Corrections to say we've got to let some people out, and we have let several out, and I'm very glad we have. We would let out more, and we have told the jails, and I don't control the jails, but we tell the jails, look, put these people on house arrest if you need to, do what you got to do, but do not put them in a position where they're never even going to get to their trial, right? And so your point is very well taken. I mean, the healthcare in our general society is not adequate if you don't have healthcare insurance. And if you're incarcerated, you definitely don't have the help that you need.
Right.
They don't have the mask on the guards. They don't have the sanitizer. People are living in very close quarters. It is a hotbed of infection, brother. And so we've got to distance people, and we've got to make that call, that clarion call. But then, like my earlier theme, it raises another question. Why are all these people in jail anyway? I mean, how many of these people haven't even gotten convicted or pled guilty? I mean, I know you got the public defender from Alameda County on. There is a movement going all across this country to say, if you are pre-trial, why do you need to be in jail all the time like that?
Right.
Particularly if you're a juvenile. I'm gonna tell you, in Hennepin County, Minnesota, they basically said, unless you are a demonstrable, imminent, and clear flight risk or danger to others, we're going to let you out of juvenile detention. This is even before the pandemic hit. And you go through when I used to be a public defender, I go through the juvenile detention center and it was full of kids. Now you could roll a bowling ball down there and there ain't no kids in there. There's a few. Do you know the no-shows have not gone up? So now the question is, why were we incarcerating all these kids pre-trial? And how does the trauma of confinement impact adult recidivism? And so we are now in a position to challenge things in a way we have not been. Now we have data. We can say, you don't need to lock these people up like that. As a matter of fact, how many people have you ever met, mostly black men and boys, who if you say, look, brother, you've been in jail for the last 6 weeks. If you plead today, you can get out today. Oh, well, I didn't do it though. Yeah, but that's the only way you're getting out. I mean, that happens. It's
Right.
naive to say it doesn't. It happens every single damn day. And so our system tolerates it because they know, because they don't really care. I mean, most of them, it's not even a hateful intent. It's just that they have a factory attitude toward justice.
Yeah.
You,
Well,
you
what do
know?
you think? What do you think? You're somebody you're working within that system, and you're
Yep.
passionate about the change that needs to happen. What do you think, are the barriers to creating any kind of lasting change? Because we've been talking about a range of reforms, which aren't enough, for years, for decades, maybe.
Yeah.
And so I'm just curious from your perch, like when you think about you're the AG of Minnesota and other folks within systems, how do those folks actually help make change that is sustainable beyond just you as a person?
We got to pass. We got to legalize marijuana. And I say that as a person who doesn't smoke marijuana. I don't use edibles. It's not a product I partake in. And I would probably advise people if they ask me, should I? I'd probably say, well, I don't, and I'm a happy person. So you don't need that to be a happy person. But I think that when you look at how that particular drug has been used to wrap Black people into the criminal justice system, it's clear that it is a tool of oppression. And so and we also need to get rid of we need to expunge every record, and we need to actually, as we set up the dispensary contracting system, you need to have you need to be very deliberate in making sure that there are African-American vendors in that system. Because if you don't do that, okay, so we're good enough to throw in jail, but when you finally legalize a system, we can't even benefit from it. I mean, I know guys say, look, man, I've been selling weed since I was 11 years old. You're gonna tell me now that you're gonna legalize it, I can't do that legally? I mean, so my point is not that it's okay to sell weed. I don't, the right wingers who are listening, I'm not saying that.
Right.
But what I am saying is that there needs to be expungement, and there needs to be very definite set aside for people who have been most adversely impacted by the system. That's one thing. And I would say that with the whole criminal justice system, we need to get rid of mandatory minimum sentencing. We need to get rid of these draconian civil forfeiture systems that Junior is caught selling marijuana out of mama's basement, so they take mama's whole house. Happens all the time. And then outside of the criminal justice, well, still within the criminal justice system, we need to say that you cannot charge people who are incarcerated for telephone calls, that you can't charge people for getting money put on their books. If you want to make sure somebody does not recidivate, one of the main ways to do it is to keep strong family ties. But if you drive up those calls and you make it really expensive to put some money on people's books, then they just won't get them calls.
Yeah.
Let
me ask you a question. As people are coming out in Minnesota, the state that you're the AG for, what are the supports for folks? Because if folks are coming out, just the normal reentry kind of issues that come up in terms of housing and job and
oh my goodness.
And if you put on top of that COVID, where folks are having to come home and be released into, if at best, situations that are not the optimal in terms of housing, because here in the Bay Area it's super expensive. So I'm just wondering, like, what kind of things are happening in Minnesota to actually receive those folks back in the community, whether it's young people like the kids that are leaving juvenile justice facilities in your state, in California where I live. Just curious about what kind of things are happening to support those families and those young people.
Dear brother, I have to be honest with you. I would not be here boasting on Minnesota's approach to reentry. I think we have a lot to do because the truth is we got people sleeping in tents who had never been involved in the criminal justice system. So if you're getting out, unless you got a family member who's going to house you, you might be finding yourself, living in a tent like all the other folk. And, and I know that this is the reality of America in 2020. The richest country in the history of the world, Jeff Bezos just said he made $178 billion during COVID, and we don't have enough money to house human beings. And they're living in tents that you go buy at the recreational camping store. And I know they're doing it in LA, they're sure doing it in Minnesota. In a few months, it's gonna be cold here. You know, so my point is, we're not doing well. What I'm telling you is we need a radical transformation of redistribution of wealth. 5 years ago, 10 years ago, you say redistribution of wealth and all the right wing would say, oh my God, socialism. I'm like, wait a minute, we do got socialism for rich people.
Right.
The money flows to them, from us to them.
Right.
And so my point is, don't tell me about Black Lives Matter, Mr. Bezos, when you are firing people for raising up safety concerns in your Amazon factory, and you're sitting on top of $178 billion in the last few months. That's ridiculous. We've got to raise the call that this money needs to be massively taxed. These companies need to be broken up. And I know that's not a specific message to exclusively Black audiences, but it would definitely benefit Black people if Amazon suddenly became 50 or 60 different companies, right?
Right.
Because you could get that contract, right?
Right.
It would help African Americans for sure if PayPal had to become 25, 30 different companies. It would help people out. You'd have more competition. You'd have more. A lot of things would be better. So I would say, you know, in Minnesota, and across the United States, we have a national housing crisis. If I may just illustrate the point quickly this way.
Please.
If you look at something called the mortgage interest deduction, those of us on the call, you know, maybe we put together enough pennies, nickels, and dimes to buy a little house. If you own a house and if you itemize, you can claim that mortgage interest deduction.
Right.
I'm not against people for having money. My point is I want people to have some prosperity. But if you're making around $120,000 a year, you're the person who's most likely to benefit from that and up. The entire budget of HUD is about $41 billion a year. The mortgage interest deduction alone is about $81 billion a year. What's my point? We spend more money subsidizing upper middle class and rich housing than we do housing for the poor. More money. It's ridiculous. It is wrong. It is that's why, you know, my Congresswoman, Ilhan Omar, has a bill called Homes for All. She says, let's just say we're going to take $2 billion a year, and we're going to stick it right up into low-income housing. We're going to make public housing, low-income housing tax credit, Section 8. We're going to make sure families have a place to live in America. Let's do that. And you know what? Wouldn't be no problem. I mean, you know, if you took $250 billion out of the military budget, they'd still have more money than any other country in the world.
That's right.
So if you took the money from the fossil fuel industry, the subsidies from Exxon, Mobil, BP, and the rest of them, you could fund the program. Housing is critical. If you talk about the racial disparity in high stakes test outcomes, we know Black kids on these high stakes tests are not doing as well as the white kids are. You know what? You can close that gap if you house everyone stably. You show me a kid who's not doing well on a standardized test, I'll show you a kid who probably has moved several times in the last 6 months.
Yeah.
He might come to school in a shelter.
And yeah, all that. Let me ask you one last question. We're almost at time for this conversation. Sure. We have a lot of funders who are part of this conversation. Our co-sponsors, hosts of this are Funders for Justice, Liberty Hill Foundation in Los Angeles, Rosenberg, California Alliance for Boys and Men of Color, as well as the Alliance, California Funders for Boys and Men of Color. And so there's some funders on the line who would love to hear some advice from you. Like, how can they be helpful from the law enforcement, transformation, juvenile justice, COVID, any of the things that you're doing in the state of Minnesota and even nationally? What role can philanthropy play in all this? Because you just talk about big money in government and Bezos money. Foundations will probably say, well, you know, our money is a little smaller, but what could they be doing to be more helpful?
You know, one of the things I want to say to people in philanthropy, first of all, is thank you very much, right? In America, it's okay to make a lot of money. If you put that money to the use of your fellow Americans, that's a good thing. If all you do is do consumer goods for yourself and buy senators off to give you even bigger tax breaks, that's not such a good thing. What I'm saying is Right now, one of our foundations in Minnesota, Minneapolis Foundation, has made a major initiative into housing. You know, we have an eviction epidemic in America, and it's going to get worse as the COVID, as you know, these executive orders lift. What you're going to see is more people who are put out of work, who are working in the gig economy. Suddenly, the landlord says, "Okay, where's my three rental payments?" Right? And if on the low end, if they're $1,000 a piece, it's like, "Where's my $3,000?" They don't have it. Mm-hmm. And even some of the rental assistance programs are not going to be able to help everybody. So you're going to have a real problem. We need philanthropy to do two things. One, step up and demand that every state legislature have a rental assistance fund. Two, start your own rental assistance fund. Three, advocate for policies that say we're going to expunge all rental records in and around the COVID crisis, and expunge all and put pressure on Fair Isaacs and all the credit reporting agencies like Experian and the other ones to say, no, you're not going to suffer any credit repercussions because of late payment during this period of time. Remember, the CARES Act helped people with subsidies. If you have a federally subsidized mortgage, you got a little bit of break under the Federal CARES Act. But half the people don't have none of that. And so, look, Brother Hodge, there's so much to talk about. I'm a mad fan of y'all in Oakland. You're doing good work in a tough time. And I just want to say I'm so grateful to be with you all. I'm going to stay on because I'm a big fan of yours and the public defender, and I want to hear him. But thank you for allowing me to be here with y'all just a little while.
Well, I want to thank you on behalf of everybody who's on the call and our co-sponsors, everybody, and myself, my family, for the work you're doing, for your passion around this, and for putting some more light into that dimly lit room. I love that metaphor. It's gonna get used again, brother. So don't, and you may get a check in the mail for it. I don't know, but you probably won't. No, don't let me say that, because I know our right-wing folks will hear me say something that's inappropriate. But thank you so much, and we really appreciate you. And please let us know how we can ever be helpful in your work. And please thank Gary Cunningham next time you see him for making the connection. We really appreciate Gary. So thank you for that. We want to bring other folks into the conversation now. We've got three other folks that I'm going to introduce and ask questions of, and then we'll open this up for you to ask questions as well. The first person that we want to hear from is the co-founder and director of the Blackout Collective. She's a longtime community organizer. Blackout Collective, in the context of the ecosystem of Movement for Black Lives, does a lot of training. I know her as an organizer with Youth Together, as well as the Center for Media Justice, and she's a longtime family friend. But Chinyere Tutashinda is with us today, and I want to invite you to say a little bit about your work on Chinyere, and I've got a few questions for you.
Okay. Hey, everyone. Thank you so much. First, I'm really honored to be here and to have been invited. So excited to join and jump into the conversation. Really enjoyed the first part, and from Mr. Ellison, deeply inspired. So thank you. So the Blackout Collective is a direct action training organization. We primarily train folks in direct action strategy, and really work specifically with Black communities across the country. We were founded in Ferguson in October of 2014 in response to a call out from organizers in Ferguson who were looking for people and direct action trainers specifically to come down and support with Ferguson October, which was an initiative to continue to raise the name of Mike Brown and being able to get justice for him. So we were looking and talking to folks all over the country who we knew were Black and had done direct action work in their organizing, but had a really difficult time getting people to, one, identify as trainers and identify as strategists. And when we went there, realized that this is a gap in our work, that very often Black people over our centuries of liberation work have used a lot of different direct action tactics to be able to fight for freedom, but did not see ourselves in that work. It had been colonized so much, and in particular, really taken out into the green environmental world that looked very white. So our work has been to really take that legacy of direct action back into our communities, into our organizing work. And we work really deeply with the Movement for Black Lives, and sit on various leadership spaces, and train people across the country.
So can you tell us, from your opinion, you're a seasoned organizer, you've been doing this work for a while, you've been involved in this since Mike Brown's death in Ferguson and all the way up until today. So we're curious about, what do you think the most important things have been that have come out of the national protests that we've seen this round, and the demands for accountability and systems transformation when it comes to law enforcement? And we're curious about what you see as like the benefits of that on the street direct action work, and how that translates to sort of long-term systems change, not even systems change, transformation, like creating new systems. What is that? What are we gaining from this period that's going to help us go forward, in your opinion?
Yeah, I think this last period was super exciting for me as someone who does this work for a while now. Being able to see, one, the pace and speed in which protests happened across the country, and the mass scope and the depth of involvement. There were hundreds of thousands of people. When we look at the numbers, and particularly from May 25th to the beginning of June, I think about approximately June 14th and a little bit further into Juneteenth, we had the most amount of people participating in direct action and participating in protests that this country has ever seen, right? And one of the things that excites me about that is there's been a couple of real changes that have come from that. So some of them are material changes, and then we can also talk about some of the narrative changes and society and cultural change work that sometimes is easily missed in the process, right? So some of the biggest material changes that I'll name is that across the country, you have seen people and organizers be able to use this moment to push forward demands and campaigns that they've been working on for a really long time around police accountability, around police funding, and in particular, really raising the question of what is the role of policing in community safety, and whether we need them in every single aspect of our lives and in things that we have to encounter, right? So you have school departments, both in the K through 12 range across the country, who broke off relationships and realized that maybe there's another way to create community safety and culture within our school walls. We had that happen on college campuses. We've had it happen at one that I think is actually really creative and exciting, is you have a whole bunch of actors and actresses who've said, actually, when we come on set, we don't need police in those spaces. We can figure out what do we look like, and have had big studios break relationships with departments and how they're going to think about security and safety, knowing that some of their talent, and Black talent in particular, we don't feel safe when this happens, right? And that they have a leverage of power there. There's also, and I think Minneapolis is an amazing example of well, what does it look like to re-envision community safety overall, right? And voted and really pushed and worked with city council folks to really vote to abolish the police department there and create something new, right? And there's a lot of organizing that's still happening in that reimagining, but those are, when I think of material changes across the board, there have been drastic shrinks in department budgets and money reinvested into communities. And then narratively and culturally, we've seen, so one of the things that Mr. Ellison named is that there are so many people who you saw out in the streets who 4 or 5 years ago were arguing with you on the validity of Black Lives Matter as a rallying cry, where that is no longer the case. And when we think about, although that may seem insignificant, when we look at some of the polling data, it's not just that they understand that Black Lives Matter. What they understand is that there is a systematic racism in this country in a way that if you had polled and we asked people years ago, that was not the case. That was not the understanding. And because without that understanding, it makes it difficult to then enact material changes.
Yeah.
So that kind of deep cultural work has happened over the past 4 and 5 years when we think of what does it mean to have a movement that has been able to capitalize on this moment.
Yeah.
And to me, that's like super exciting. Like, I'm not a sports fan, but I'm here watching NBA and they have all the like BLM things, or the same with baseball. Like, those are cultural moments that 3 years ago we had athletes, who lost their jobs. You have Kaepernick, who lost his job in San Francisco because of being able to take a stand and just name that Black life is important and being killed and that systematic racism exists. So there's been massive changes that have just happened in such a short time.
Yeah. Let me ask you one other question, and then we're going to bring Brendon Woods on to join the conversation. For you, when you think about the disparities, both in terms of incarceration and issues around state-sponsored killings, and the disparities we're seeing with COVID, those are similar disparities for similar reasons. So I'm just wondering, from your vantage point as an organizer, as somebody who's been working with Movement for Black Lives, how have you all connected these issues?
Yeah, I think that one of the ways that we try to connect them, and very often because we came out of issues around policing that people don't often see or hear, is understanding that there are systems, right? That it's not accidental that Black people are the ones who get killed by the police at such alarming rates. And it's not accidental that Black folks are like the most, or they're not quite the most, but they are like really impacted by COVID, right? That the death rates are higher, that our socioeconomic status is different, that we know that we live in a capitalist system where Black people were brought here as labor and as property. And that because we have built on that system and there have been incremental changes to transform it that are real and material and have been substantial, and yet we know that it's not enough. So as the Movement for Black Lives, we try to continuously, like, part of why being able to say we're fighting for all Black lives is important, because we know that every person might not feel, or every Black person might not be interacting as high with a criminal justice system, but they are with an education system that is treating them bad. They are when we look at COVID and we have all of the essential workers who can't get off, right? Or people who are fighting, again, this housing crisis is really real. So we know that there's so many different avenues and so many different ways that our people are being attacked. And primarily because we live in a system of like racialized capitalism. So we try to paint that picture, being able to tell that story in ways that people can come along with us. So that we can get to someplace else. And I would also name then, like, part of what we also are working to do is have solutions that go with it, right? So we can look at our vision for Black lives. We re-released part of our policy stuff around like, what is our response to COVID and what is our responsibility in this moment with housing, with jobs, with our lack of access to healthcare, right? That there are so many things that this system doesn't provide that have caused the death of Black people and the unnecessary death of Black people.
Yeah, cool. Well, Chin, thank you. And we're going to just stay on. We're going to bring on our next thought partner in this. Brendon Woods has served as the public defender here in Alameda County since 2012. Chinyere is sitting in New York. Keith Ellison was in Minnesota. And we're now moving to Oakland in terms of that. But Brendon also is a native New Yorker, grew up in Jamaica, Queens. He's been a public defender since 1996, and he was appointed in December of 2012 as the first African-American public defender in Alameda County. So we want to welcome Brendon Woods, the chief public defender in Alameda County, to the conversation as well. Hey, Brendon.
Hi, how are you doing? Thank you for having me.
Good. How are you doing this morning?
I'm doing okay. I'm happy to be here.
Good, good. Well, you've been listening to the conversation with Brother Ellison and with Chinyere, and I'm just curious, just to start out, if you could talk about your work here in Alameda County in terms of how the COVID virus has intersected with the work that you do to get people out of our prisons and out of our jails during this pandemic. What's been accomplished? What have been the barriers? And what are you hopeful about, if there's any hope in any of it?
Sure. So before I even get to that, you mentioned one thing in the introduction that I want to come back and focus on. You talked about me being the first African-American public defender in Alameda County, the first Black person to run this office. And I think that's kind of critically important when you think about what we do, the population we serve, that it wasn't until 2012 that a Black person held this position in Oakland, California, home of the Black Panthers, the Bay Area, arguably one of the most liberal parts of the state, maybe the nation. And it wasn't until 2012. That's absolutely embarrassing and shameful. And then when we talk about this conversation about race and racial injustice, I'm going to add another layer to that. Currently, in the entire state of California, the entire state, I'm the only chief Black public defender. So,
wait, in the entire state?
The entire state.
In 58 counties.
58 counties. And so when we talk about Black Lives Matter, and we talk about racial injustice, and we talk about white supremacy, I want to also frame that from the lens of Black power. That's not mentioned enough. We don't talk about that enough, but there needs to be more what I'm going to call Black power, Black people in positions of power to affect change for our people. And if people really care about the systemic racism, they're also going to focus on that. So I just wanted to get that out there. So to call your question first, I was talking about what we've done around COVID right now. And it feels like since March that I've lived 10 lifetimes. It's been so much work that's been done, and we've been primarily focused on getting people out of jail, getting people out of prison. When COVID hit in March and we realized what COVID was going to be, we began our work immediately. And for reference, we have to think about where we're at in Alameda County. We have Santa Rita Jail. It is a monster. It's the third largest jail in California, the fifth largest jail in the nation. It is absolutely huge. It holds about 3,500 people. It has one of the highest rates of in-custody deaths for any jail in California. It's been under several lawsuits, so we knew right then and there we had to get people out of custody as quickly as possible. And so in the beginning of March, I sent a letter to the presiding judge, the sheriff, and DA asking for release the people with 6 months left to serve, ask for people who are at high risk of medical conditions, people over the age of 50, anyone who is being held in a misdemeanor or non-serious felony, ask for mass releases on people. Those releases weren't granted right away. We got about 300 people out in the first week or so, and then there's more of a fight to get the rest out. And a big turning point for us was when the first person in Santa Rita Jail tested positive for COVID in April. I think it was on April 4th, and a few days later, there were 15 positives. So we started to see a rapid spread of COVID in Santa Rita Jail. And that was what was able to give us more pressure, more leverage on the courts and the DA to get more people out. And then we were also able to implement what's called zero bail. And as you heard earlier, bail is a really huge systemic problem in regards to racism in our courts. There's so many people who are held pre-trial in custody, in jails, just because they can't afford to bail out or pay their bail. So we're able to get the court to adopt what's called zero bail. And that's where all misdemeanors mostly are set at zero bail. All non-violent misdemeanors, non-violent felonies are set at zero bail. So it results in a massive release of people. And we've been able to reduce the jail population in Santa Rita Jail from about 2,600 to about 1,800. So a reduction of over 35%. And because of that, it really helped in some ways keep the number of people who've been infected by COVID down. And I think that's really what people have to be focused on is mass decarceration to keep people safe. There's no way you can keep people safe in a jail or a prison during COVID because they can't social distance. They just can't do it. You're living on top of one another. And then added to that, the jails and prisons just aren't equipped to handle this sort of medical outbreak. They're not able to do it. And then we've done a lot of work recently around prisons. Most recently, it's been focused on the issue of the massive outbreak in San Quentin. I've been going to San Quentin visiting pretty frequently and have a lot of relationships with people in custody there. And back in May, I received a letter from someone I know, and that letter was kind of predicting what's going to happen in regards to COVID. It's like, we need help, people need to get released, or this disease is going to come and spread and hit rapidly. And that was received in May prior to them having their first positive test. And in that letter he sent me, there was 289 signatures of men in custody who were saying, we need help. And so I sent that off to the governor. I'm asking for help. I got no response. I sent another letter with some suggestions about how to decarcerate, got very little response. And then we were able to, in the course of 4 days, gather about 10,000 signatures of people who were saying there needs to be massive releases. We sent those into the governor. There was a lot more public pressure from the Ella Baker Center. All of us, and then people were applying a lot of pressure. And it did result in some releases, but nowhere near enough. The governor recently decided to release about 8,000 people. They said up to 8,000, which is only about 6.5% of the prison population. Medical experts are saying there has to be a reduction of about 50% to keep people safe. And so we're not where we need to be, but we have to keep applying pressure to the governor and to the secretary to get more people released.
Yeah. So from your perspective, when people are released, what is the sort of status of the safety net, if you will? Like when people need a place to live, need to have food, need to be able to have some sort of meaningful income. Like, are you seeing, the system sort of stepping up, or the system still pretty weak and anemic with regard to that? And I'm yeah.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
So I think it depends on where you're at, with regards to how the system steps up. And I'm going to back up a little bit, because I think there's a little bit of a false narrative that's put out there sometimes around people who are getting released. I've been at several rallies in front of San Quentin, and there are family members saying, release my son, release my brother, release my husband, I can house them. So there's this false narrative, particularly around Black people. You send them out, they're going to be violent, they're going to be homeless, this and that. That is not true. These people who are in custody have families who are willing to take them in and care for them. And being out of custody, being with a family member is 10 times safer than being in custody during COVID. And so, for example, under these new early releases coming back to Alameda County, we've got about 65 people coming back. Out of the 8,000, only 65 coming to our county. And 2/3 of those people have housing. They have families that can take them. So I want to really be careful about this narrative about, all these people are going to be out there, are going to be homeless, are going to be committing crimes. That's not true. And then for the few people that will be released and have housing instability or food instability, there are a great network of community-based organizations that can help. There needs to be state funding to accommodate the extra people that are coming out, but these organizations are great. They need to be funded, and they can fill that void, and they have been filling that void. They've been showing up and taking care of people as they've been released.
Okay. What are some of the other barriers you think are in place? When I asked Keith Ellison this question from his perspective with AG in Minnesota, like, what are the barriers to long-term systems transformation? Like, we all have wanted to do things differently. I know one thing about your office is that when you took over as the chief public defender, you changed the approach to representation. You had a previous system where there was one lawyer for each stage of the proceedings, from pretrial to arraignment to trial to sentencing. Now you're doing a more sort of holistic form of representation. That's a significant change in terms of having one attorney working with the same client throughout the process and helping them find housing supports, economic and job supports, and that sort of thing. That's an example of how a system can get changed, at least somewhat, from the inside. I'm just curious, like, where you see barriers in terms of how you do your work going forward, because there's all this conversation around defunding police, conversations around law enforcement. And I think you mentioned us in our planning call. We ought to be thinking more broadly than that. So I'd love for you to talk about that for a little bit.
Sure. So I think this was mentioned earlier. There are multiple systems that are in place. I'm focused on the criminal justice system, and we have to think about how systemic racism comes from almost every system, or infects every system there is, whether it be housing, whether it be employment, whether it be immigration. It's there, and all these systems talk to each other at a lightning speed, and they help to oppress people of color everywhere. And that's kind of how they're set up. And in doing so, we're scared to say it sometimes, but this system of white supremacy is really embedded in our nation. It's embedded in our culture. And there's got to be more effort to actively confront that, because if we're not doing that, we're not going to make any moves or any steps forward. So when it comes to, I think, about directly impacting the criminal punishment system or criminal injustice system, whatever you want to call it, I hate to say justice system. There are so many issues, whether it be bail reform that was mentioned earlier, that needs to be addressed, because people should not be in custody pre-trial just because they're poor. That should not happen. You know that affects Black and brown people at disproportionate rates. One thing that needs to be reformed is jury reform. It is impossible to get people of color on juries, sometimes where the jury pool is comprised, where they're pulled from, and what tools our prosecutors have to strike Black people from juries. And then sentencing reform. We've got to be looking at how we are incarcerating people and sending them to prison for minor offenses for long periods of time. Those are three things that have to be addressed.
Okay. Brendon, thank you so much. And I want you to hang on with us. We're going to bring our last panelist on, Jamal Jones from the Baltimore Algebra Project and co-director of the National Youth Alliance. We're going to talk to Jamal a little bit, and then we'll get all three of you on to answer a few questions that are coming. So Jamal has been doing this work for a few years. He's been a very active member of the National Youth Alliance, an organization that represents and works with about 350 different organizations around the country. Good morning, Jamal. How you doing this morning in Baltimore?
Well, it's afternoon over here, but I'm doing good, Bob. How are you? How's everybody?
And I'm blessed. It's good to see you this morning, and we want to get you in the conversation because we know that you've been doing a lot of work with your comrades and colleagues with National Youth Alliance. And we're curious about what are the main issues that, the organizations that you're working with when it comes to criminal justice. I know you all have been doing work on the ground in a lot of ways, and you, like everybody else, are affected by COVID. So I'm just curious about how things have been for National Youth Alliance and the work you're doing over the last few months when it comes to the protests, systems transformation, and COVID. It's a multi-part question to get you in the conversation.
Okay, I appreciate it, and I'm gonna hope that I can wrestle with it as best as I can. I guess it's a really interesting relationship, to say the least, because while this is the first time that any of us have experienced a pandemic in the way that COVID has occurred, it is also in many ways a catalyst for a lot of the change that's occurred. There's been a whole lot of folks doing a lot of work across the country, and I'm pretty sure it hasn't fallen on deaf ears, and I'm sure folks have paid attention to some of the stuff. Minneapolis schools Minneapolis school district just severed their contract with the school district, for SROs and school police. And there was a similar efforts all across the country right now.
In Oakland as well.
In Oakland also. So it's a similar efforts all across the country. And also, there's a lot of stuff, particularly in California, around the jails and reducing population. One of the things that had been clear or came up in one of the recent calls was that basically, due to COVID, what they're noticing is that there's been a trend downward in juvenile incarcerations. And maybe that's good, maybe that's not, but just being clear and just kind of paying attention to that. So folks have been making sure to keep a pulse on our people who are inside and still kind of working behind that wall or being behind the wall, as Brendon was talking about. And then, of course, there's the general base building work that everyone's doing, because there's this overwhelmingly new sense of political ethos. And the thing is, if you study history, you know that this type of thing ebbs and flows. It ebbs and flows. And so it's a question of capitalizing on that moment. But I think that between COVID making the world stop and sit still, and freeing folks up of their time, I think what we're seeing is the fruits of what Claude Anderson would call Black people's labor, right? All of the labor over this time, and we've been able to actually focus that labor on what we want specifically, has yielded that. And just kind of wanting to highlight also a lot of the groups that folks are noticing some of the change and seeing policy wins and shifts in different counties. Those campaigns have been going on for years. Years and years and years. A couple years ago, the National Youth Alliance went on a campaign to raise $4.5 million to have a re-granting pool for community awards. And the community awards were essentially for a lot of the groups who typically don't make it into a foundation's portfolio based on their outwardly facing posture. And those groups are a lot of the ones that are pushing those policy wins and shifting things, like being at the school board. So a lot of those clips that folks are seeing, a lot of the sound bites people are hearing, those are from organizers who've been working on the ground for years. And this has happened to be a moment where there's a lot of stuff happening and people are actually able to pay attention. And then the other thing that I wanted to just kind of add on to that is there's been a push now as we're like folks are talking about and figuring out what does it look like to move our folks from behind the wall in terms of criminal justice, on how to start to center some of the boys and men, not center, but how to recenter this boys and men of color work so that the framework includes girls and women of color and families more specifically, and so that we can start to also focus on the depopulation efforts for our girls and women of color who are incarcerated and also under the same kind of conditions that Black men and other people of color are in particular. And just want to shout out Breonna Taylor and mention that we have not gotten a chance to arrest her killers yet. And so if folks have a moment in their time to send an email, copy and paste a message, and all you gotta do is go online and search it and literally it'll show up, copy and paste send. But the high level things that I think I'm seeing mostly and like the network is talking about amongst all, and just to be clear, the National Youth Alliance is an alliance of 5 networks: the Alliance for Educational Justice, Dignity in Schools Network, ABMOC, Communities for Just Schools, CJNY, yeah, CJNY, and OYU, Opportunity Youth Network. And so basically, amongst the network, the major things that are showing up is like getting rid of cash bail so that we can stop having our people being for sale, and figuring out alternatives for that kind of situation. Figuring out how to like get young women and girls out of jails too, because there hasn't been a whole lot of the conversation in terms of the depopulation efforts. A whole lot of energy around school police, and I'm just checking my notes. A whole lot of energy around school police and police accountability in particular right now. And I think that the last thing is around this idea of being able to reshape what budgets look like. And so there's like a whole bunch of conversation, particularly within the groups who are working on prison reforms and like being able to take doing the depopulation work on how to, there's a strategy to both defund a thing, but also to imagine and envision what the new thing is and be able to build that and project that as the new articulation for what we define safety as, or whatever the case may be.
Yes. Can you say a little bit more about that? Like this whole idea of how to redefine safety, like of the young people that you're working with in those organizations, and as they get to be millennials, when they think about having their own children and taking kids to school, and the argument becomes then if you don't have SSOs, you don't have school police officers, how do we make sure that kids are safe if there's some incident? What's your perspective about that? And how do other member organizations of the NYA think about that question?
I think that there's a difference between police and safety. And I think that when we think about safety, oftentimes because of the way things have occurred for so long in this place, that we default to policing, or we like default to certain things. But I don't think that safety inherently means policing. And I think someone mentioned earlier that it's a tool on a tool belt, and the question is like, how do we stop using the hammer all the time, because then everything looks like a nail, to that same point. And I also just want to, there's a thing that I typically say, and you've probably heard me mention this before, where like, if you were to imagine in a typical space where students and youth and people are, like schools or recreation center or whatever, those spaces, when you close your eyes and think about it, they're safe, they're fun, they're loving, they are filling, but they do not necessarily encompass a police officer standing with a bulletproof vest and a gun. And that is part of the contradiction between like the reality of how we apply safety and how we think about safety. And to just give an example of that, one of the things that students here in Baltimore have talked about is like taking the school district's SRO budget and then creating a list of community folks who will be paid with their same staff salary money, who will be the community safety team, and they would deal with those types of issues and be trained on all types of like de-escalation tactics and whatever else, and partner with like the actual Baltimore Police Department if need be or as needed in a world where something escalated to be that much. But having effectively what folks are trying to do right now is figure out what is the alternative that we want to produce, and then being able to cost with that.
Thank you. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to bring Chinyere and Brendon back, and we'll keep Jamal in the conversation. So we got questions that are populating in our chat box in our question area. And first question is got answered privately, but I want to, this is a good question to ask publicly. This one happens to be from Bob Ross, who's the co-chair of the Executive Alliance for Boys and Men of Color and CEO of California Endowment. And this question was directed to Chinyere, but I will also direct it to Jamal and Brendon if you have an answer to this. And the question was, you know, what might support infrastructure look like for Black organizers? For folks who are doing that work, you know, what is it that you need to support the work and grow it? And then I'm going to connect that to a question from Joe Brooks, who's a member of the Brotherhood Elders Network here in Oakland. And he asked, do you think how can this, first of all, do you think that this moment can become more of a movement, and that could reparations be a centerpiece of that? So it's a two-part question. What's the support structures you need in your organizations that Philanthropy and others may be able to help with? And where do we find ourselves in terms of going from a set of moments to a full-blown movement that can be sustained and have reparations for Black folks involved in that? And anybody can start. Let me start with Chinyere. Let me start with you.
Okay, I'm ready. So I'm going to answer the last one first.
All right.
I think very often and I would say this as I actually think it's a tool of media, is that we live in a place where now organizations call themselves movements. We live in a time where that's the case and don't quite understand what it means when we say movement. And I'm not saying this for you at all, but like generally, I don't think that people kind of have the concept of what that means and understands a full movement cycle, right? So when we say, can this moment become a movement? I think it already is. I think that movement, one, is a continuation. And then if we're going to put like demarcations in that part, then I could like clearly demark August 9th, 2014, when Mike Brown was killed, and there was mass mobilizations and organizations that formed, coalitions that partnered and have continued and been in work. And there have been wins along the way, whether that's social, cultural, or material, and continued connections and webbings that have happened. So part of why this moment in particular was the size that it was, and people were able to even get the advances that were able to happen, is because that organizing and that infrastructure has been laid, right? So I think that is important to name, to continue to reiterate, and really redefine on the like social, cultural ethos of what a movement means. Because I don't think that we talk about it in the way that we need to. Yeah. So that's the first part to me. And then the second part is like, what does it mean to kind of lay that infrastructure? I can name it for philanthropy, but just broadly, and I can get to maybe the second question after other people have around philanthropy. But broadly, I think that people and Black folks, at least the Black organizers that I've worked with, and because I run a training organization, I get to travel and like meet and network with people all over the country, is that people need a few things, right? One, I think that definitely additional funding, and I think there's a role of philanthropy and would love to talk about that, but need that to be, they need to be able to be trusted. I think that we have devalued and deprioritized organizing work, and what does it mean to really build bases in this country? And what does it mean to create and value organizing work that happens in Black communities? So when people talk about infrastructure, we're talking about that. One of my favorite phases, and it's in part because I run training orgs, is that leaders are not born. Like, it actually is not true. People are fed into, right? I am here because I was trained, because I have been fed into from my parents, for community members, to trainings that I have gone to, right? And I'm not talking about just in academic institutions, but trainings and mentorship. So training organizations are vital to our work. And that's the kind of like infrastructure between continuously investing in places where people can build that relationships to deepen our organizing work.
Cool. Thank you for that. Jamal, how would you answer the question? Where and in what ways do you see a movement that can be sustained, and what kind of infrastructure supports do the organizations that are part of NYA need to actually take full advantage of this moment in a good way?
Okay, so I'm gonna go in reverse just like you, Chinyere. And so I struggle with this whole moment to moment verbiage all the time. And it's because like when you study history, you realize that there's always a movement and that there are moments that people pay attention to. And then there are moments that people don't pay attention. And so like I struggle sometimes with that verbiage because a lot of that really to me when it's like in terms of answering that question of like how do you make that moment into movements long term, it really just feel like resourcing it, which is like again we're paying attention to it again.
Yeah.
But it's a lesson of like resourcing the thing while it is not sexy. And so it's like the question of this Philadelphia, as long as it's been here across this place, I almost made satirical words. Philadelphia's been forever. And the Sixers were bad for a long time. The Sixers were bad. And they stuck it out with them. They kept paying salaries. They kept holding people down. They came up and went back to the drawing board. They did what they had to do. They recruited new staff. They trained. And then they got right. And now they're in the playoffs. For all my folks who like sports analogies. But I said to say, right, there's a need to be consistent on both sides, but the resourcing has to also be there in order for that to be the case. And so I think about the number of organizations who could be doing much more like base building work if we had much more robust, and this is speaking to the infrastructure question, if we had more robust comm systems. And I mean, we could say, like, I could like, get the general off the top pieces, right? Like you got to get more funding. People need more money. You need the TA stuff. We definitely need like training people. But I think the difference that I've seen in the work that I've been around is part of the infrastructure is the folks in philanthropy themselves. And I mean like the individual actors who can pull and push those different leverage points and be co-conspirators in this work and not necessarily spectators, but in-game players who are actively moving pieces beyond just I'm gonna inbound the ball to you with a grant and kind of check in from there. I need you to actually be running the floor with me. So,
good. Thank you. Brendon, how do you think about this from the vantage point of, you're a public official, you're involved with trying to get people out of jail, moving your system. So how do you think about your system in the context of a movement? And what kind of infrastructure needs do you have? Because I know sometimes counties don't give PD offices all of what they need. That's probably an understatement. So I'm just wondering from you, like how you think about the political climate that you're doing your work in, and where are the supports that you need to extend that work.
So I think I'm going to back up just a little bit. Some of the best supports that I've had in this position have come from community organizers and community groups. Having strong community organizers and community groups makes my job easier, because when something is going down in the courts that's not right, I can call on them and say, we need support, we need help. And I think there's got to be a better relationship nationwide between public defenders and community organizations, more focus on participatory defense where community members are actively engaged with what's happening in court and communicating with the public defenders so they can have a more well-rounded education and a form of attack for that system, because the system's not going to go away, it's going to stay, and you've got to keep pressing and attacking it almost daily. When it comes to funding, I wish that philanthropy would pay attention to public defense, because it really doesn't happen. And when we talk about the system of mass incarceration that cages Black and brown people nonstop, you have to look at the funding. Look at the funding, for example, Alameda County. It's a liberal county, very quote unquote liberal. The sheriff's office budget is $430 million. Okay, that's 10 to 1 based on my budget, 10 to $1. The DA's budget is 80 million. That's 2 to 1. You look at OPD, their budget's $300 million. So if you pay people to police, patrol, prosecute, and incarcerate, we're going to have a system of mass incarceration. You've got this one little government agency over here, which its whole job is to decarcerate, to get people out of jail, to fight authority, and it's not funded. No one pays for that. And so, and the thing is, compared to other public defender offices, we're actually doing better. Not where we should be, but we're better. And so if you're not funding people to fight against the system's going to do what it does. And then you've got to be able to expand that. And as I talked about the system before, we have immigration attorneys in our office, which is not normal for a public defender's office. We have social workers. We have justice advocates who are recent college graduates who do housing benefits, healthcare, helping find jobs. We have a lot more services here, but every public defender should be doing that. It shouldn't just be here at Alameda County. We should all be focused on attacking all those collateral consequences that come from the criminal injustice system.
Thank you for that. We are, again, we're taking questions in our chat box. We've got about 15 minutes left. And one question we have, and I would love it, is whether our panelists know the answer to this or not. If folks who are on the call listening could populate the chat with the answers, there's Donna Ruin, who's a good friend from North Carolina, does a lot of work with boys, men of color, and women and girls of color as well, is asking what Black-led firms have expertise analyzing city budgets to catalyze redistribution or reallocation to promote equity and thriving for Black people. So in some ways, it goes to Brendon's point about budgets, that often we don't look at the budgets in the way that you just described it, like the comparative look in terms of how much the DA has, how much OPD or any local police department, the sheriff's office at the county level, and then the minuscule amount by comparison that public defender's office have. Resources are there. The question is, do we know any firms, Black-led, brown-led, people of color firms that actually can help us analyzing that? And I don't know if anybody on the panel has an answer to that before we go to our next question, but if not, we'll look for that answer in our chat box. Any of you, Chin, anybody, have you all met anybody as you move around the country who does that kind of work?
Yeah, so I would say there's two groups that pop into my mind. So one is ACRE. It's the Action Center on Race and the Economy. They primarily do research,
Okay.
and then do some like political education work. It is Black-led and super Black focused. And then the other one that I know has done some of this work is Law for Black Lives. So it's a legal organization that primarily does legal trainings, but also runs clinics. And through those clinics have done lots of budget analysis, budget research. So those two spaces. And in fact, ACRE just produced a website, which I can put in the chat once I pull it up again, that lets you put in your zip code and it'll like pull up your police budget in comparison to other things, right? So it does a lot of that kind of comparison and research work.
Excellent. Thank you for that resource. Anybody else on the panel have a response to that before we go to our next question? All right. So I want to go back to, and again, we have some funders on the call who are curious about how they can be more helpful. So when you all think about your work, what are the sort of concrete ways that you need philanthropy to show up? And what does a movement need now? What is it maybe during the next year, whether it's from mediation or advocacy or providing political cover, just direct, funding investments, learnings, convenience? What are the ways that you think philanthropy could be the most helpful? And let me start with Jamal on that one, and then we'll work our way across the panel.
So I'll go back to the people part. I'll always say that. I think that people is the key ingredient in being able to make shift in social systems. I'm sorry. And then I think the other thing that I would add in there, I would say if philanthropy is really trying to like figure out what it should be doing long term. I think one, if there are dollars available that people can put out the door for long term strategic planning, I think that that is like a key thing right now. I know that we live in an ever changing world, and like it's gonna be a thing, and people are gonna need time and the ability to shift and like do things in that lane. And I think also there's like a level of relationship building and like outwardly reaching relationship building with organizations. To Brendon's point, I think that the same relationship that he has with the organizations in OPD is like the kind of relationship ideally we would like to have with like the resource part and the people part of our movement in terms of moving that to a long-term situation. And then I think the last piece I'll land on is like there is so organizing ain't sexy, and people don't want to. People generally are not funding organizing, but like everything is levels and scale to everything, right? And so like there's community organizing, there's like youth organizing, all these different lanes. What I would focus on, and this is kind of just coming from my National Youth Alliance lane, um, most major movements have started with young people and had young people centered in that. And I don't know where we are as a field if we do not have a massive investment in youth organizing in particular, because that is where the training and development is going to occur for our next generation, for my kids and for the kids that come behind them. And quite frankly, there are a lot of folks who posture as, because we understand, because we know how the social service sector works. So a lot of folks who posture as like youth development who actually are just trying to procure wealth off of that, and they are in the way oftentimes, especially in the realm of like government contracts, to be able to just do that. And oftentimes youth organizing isn't like, you have to repackage youth organizing for those types of things in order to just provide that kind of service. And it would be nice if there was a level of A, resources for youth organizing explicitly, but B, a level of like field legitimization for youth organizing, so that people can spend time doing youth organizing and explicitly name that. So we don't gotta keep tiptoeing around, because part of the reason is we gotta keep recreating the playbook. Everybody write their own coded language for what this is, you know, how we doing this, but actually we just all systems changing. So can we get on the same page?
That's right. Cool. Thank you for that. Yeah, Chinyere, your ideas about any additional ways that philanthropy could be supported?
Yeah, so I definitely agree. A lot of what Jamal just named, and I come out of youth organizing is my background. So I'm like, double check. So what I would name when thinking about philanthropy, and I'm in spaces at this point where people ask that, I get that question. And I'm really honored to be able to really have thought about it. So we live in a country, and I think it's been named several times, like that's built on racial capitalism, right? Which means then that who has the money generally has the power, right? And very often our people, like I'm in constant battles with our people around who funds us, who doesn't fund BLM, who doesn't fund M4BL, because old white men are now controlling things, right? And there are elements to truth in that around how philanthropy has operated in the past. Yeah. And what I name is that we're in a moment, and have been, where we're trying to interrupt that. And I think that when I think of philanthropy and the role is that, what does it mean to actually be partners, right? That we work and can operate in a space where the power to not just grant money and power to convene, like understanding that that actually sets agendas, and it can, and that's not the role of philanthropy, right? The role of philanthropy is to listen, to fund, and that partnership looks like, what does it mean to be able to go to an organization or two and not just say, I'm here because this is the organization, I've heard good work, but what does it mean to be a longtime supporter, to give multi-year dollars? When we're looking at movement building and real infrastructure building, then what does it mean to fund a sector? And for a sector to be able to come to you and say, this is what we need, right? So at the Movement for Black Lives in particular, we're an ecosystem of about 150 organizations across the country, and have taken several years to draft, like, this is what we want to do, this is what it means to be a part of us, and this is how we plan to grow, and have taken that to philanthropy, right? And really trying to experiment with a different model of doing it. Instead of saying, oh, this is what you're funding right now, like, actually listen and say, this is what needs to be funded. And if we're in a true partnership, then that's okay with you actually not having that power anymore. Because that's the moment that we're in. And that happens in so many different places, and it's difficult. It's difficult for program officers who get this job, who oftentimes come from a variety of different socioeconomic statuses and now also have a little bit of power because you can grant dollars. It's difficult if it's a family foundation and it's your money and you feel a level of ownership to it, right? But it's really around, how are we detaching? If we're talking about true systems change and we're talking about attacking racial capitalism, then we have to shift that power relationship, right? So, and that even comes to the back end when thinking about reporting. If we have grants from 40 different foundations, can we agree on one reporting form? Like, it's something as simple as that, which may feel really important to you as a program officer, but as a person on the other end who has to write all of that, it's those little things of how are we shifting and continuously shifting our power dynamic that happens in philanthropy. So yes, to fund all the things that he named, and let's really start unpacking how power is held in philanthropy.
So more partnership, move the power to things like endow organizations as opposed to year-to-year kind of fundraising. General support over multiple years is better than just the programmatic supports. What I've noticed, even in this pandemic, that a lot of foundations, California Endowment being one, has said, we want to free up as much as we can to give you general support, because we know you're going to be reacting to things that are different than, say, a year ago when a grant was made. One last thing with Brendon, and then we're going to start wrapping this up. Brendon, anything else you would add about the role of philanthropy? Anything in terms of how it supports? You said a lot about what you're doing. Anything else you would add to that?
I think I've covered it all, and I want to agree with the other two panelists also. I really want to emphasize that from my seat as a public defender, having strong community organizers just empowers us more and gives more power to our clients. It's so impactful to be able to call on other community organized groups saying, this is what's happening in court, we need some assistance. This is what's happening in this court with this judge, we need some assistance. Or this bail is a real issue, and having them run with the problem. Having that relationship is invaluable. And if I can, going back to something that Jamal said earlier, when he was talking about safety, it really hit with me, because I think about how we as a nation define safety. And it's always, whether we realize it or not, it's through a lens of race. That's how it comes down to, because when you think of a safe neighborhood, usually people think of white neighborhoods, right? And so because of that framework, America's view of safety ends up incarcerating Black and brown people. Public safety, the way we've achieved that right now, is by putting Black and brown people in cages, in mass. That's what we do. So if I want to put anything forward, it's how we need to redefine what is safe. Black people, I think, know what's safe. You know, I feel safer in East Oakland than I do in like Alameda, where I might get pulled over by a white cop. Okay, that's reality. So we know what safety is, and it's about getting the broader population to change their views and ideas of safety. Because as you heard me say earlier, there's so much money placed in prosecution and incarceration that doesn't have to be spent there. That should be going to community. We are depopulating left and right, and crime is not going up. So the sheriff's budget doesn't need to stay at $400 million. OPD doesn't need to stay at $300 million. Let's start reinvesting that money into communities. And so that's what I'm saying.
Got it. Cool. Thank you. I'm gonna give each of you just a minute, if you would, take literally a minute, because we're almost at time. Any closing comments? We have one question about arts and how people can support their families, and if you have anything around that, and this notion of reintegration efforts. And it comes from Robin. Robin, we'll send you my email address, and we can put you in touch with some folks here in Northern California who are doing some of that reintegration, reentry work. Groups, and I'll just say one would be legal services for prisons with children, and All of Us or None. If you go to All of Us or None's website, you'll see a lot about what they're doing. organization that's 60% organization is formerly incarcerated folks, returning citizens. So they have a very good perspective about all of this. They do advocacy work, they do support work, and Robin, they may help you with your piece. But let me start with Brendon, and I'm going to go to Jamal and then Chinyere. 1 minute. Any last thing you want to say before we close up? Anything you felt like I should have said this? Yeah. Let me start with Brendon, and then we'll come to Jamal and Chinyere.
I'm just going to end with this. I am cautiously optimistic about where we are right now on the spectrum of movement and moment. Cautious because George Floyd sparked something, but as we all know, he's not the first unarmed black person killed by police. He's not the first. So it is great that people are paying attention right now. I always am skeptical. One thing was just because of there's COVID, everyone's sheltered in place, they have nothing better to do. But I am optimistic, and I hope that we're able to maintain this energy, and all those people who were out there marching who would not have normally been out there, hopefully they can maintain their focus and provide real support. A march isn't enough, right? You've got to pay attention to what's happening in your local politics, in your national politics, vote, and really create some change. So that's my final comment. And thank you for having me on this panel. I love it. The two panels, you guys are awesome. I wish I would have known you guys earlier. It's been great. Thank you.
No, it's been great. Thank you. Yeah, go ahead, Jamal. Any last word?
Yeah, but I was over here struggling with the mute button. That's first.
Okay.
So I guess what I'll say is one of my major takeaways just kind of coming out of this is that this space, similar to all the other spaces I've been in, whether it's on Zoom calls or like some social distancing version of meetings that have occurred over the last few months, there is a clarity on need to do something. What I'm fearful of, and what I hope folks can help me quell the fear of, is that the lack of clarity and the opaque version of the future that we have will stop people from moving. And we're going to miss the moment of the high energy, and we're going to be talking about how to build that back up again. And so, I guess the thing that I'm landing on the most is it's people doing stuff now, and people been doing stuff, and we got more people doing stuff, and we got to all keep doing more stuff. So whatever we got to do to move some of those next action items, for real, if you get off of this and you don't send an email to somebody about how we can do something different, then we won't be having this conversation again, and you part of the reason.
Yeah, cool. Thank you for that, Jamal. Yeah, Chinyere, any last word, recommendations for folks who are on this call, who are doing the work, who are funding the work? Anything else you want to add?
Yeah, I think I'm grateful for being here. And then I would also say that I'm grateful for folks who jumped on, right? So there's something in being able to take some kind of action, whether it's listening and learning and figuring out how do we incorporate that. I think that we're at an intersection currently of so many different things, and that there's an awakening that's happening, right? I think that we've been in that process. Arundhati Roy talks about this moment around the pandemic as a portal. And I think that it is, right? We have the intersections of COVID, and we have what has happened with police violence that have continued to happen, but there's something about people being able to see in this moment in ways that we haven't been able to see, because some of the veins and veils that racial capitalism has is different. So I guess the thing that I'd want people to leave with is knowing that as that veil lifts and we move into the fall, I actually think there'll be a need for more of us. There'll be a need for more people to really hunker down and understand what it means to be in the long run. We didn't touch on it here, but the election is very present for me as I came off of a call right before here about what happens in November and all the different scenarios. And I think that it'll be another moment that really tells the truth about who we are as a country. So I'm excited that people are here and learning and want us to kind of deepen and be able to stay in this. Because the unveiling will continue to unveil more, and we need more and more people to be on the side of justice with us.
Cool. I want to thank all of you, Jamal, Chinyere, Brendon, and Keith Ellison for spending a little bit of time with us today. Want to thank again our co-sponsors, Funders for Justice, Liberty Hill Foundation, Rosenberg Foundation, California Funders for Boys and Men of Color, and the Alliance for Boys and Men of Color. We represent the Executive Alliance for Boys and Men of Color, which our role is to amplify the voice in the field for boys and girls who are struggling for their liberation, to support our field organizations, people who are doing organizing as well as after-school supports like Jamal is doing with Algebra Project, and to learn and more importantly to act together. So we want to thank you all very much. Stay tuned for more. We'll be doing more webinars over the next several weeks. And as Chinyere said, as we all lead up to a national election as well as local elections, to get our folks involved, get folks registered to vote. I got to say, my favorite quote from President Obama now is like, don't boo, vote. Thank you all very much. Have a good afternoon or evening wherever you are, and we'll see you next time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.